On Being an Addict, written by Jason Gray. February 5th, 2026, 6026 Anno Lucis, in the Year of Light. Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. I did not become an addict because I wanted to disappear. I became an addict because I wanted to stay. That is the inversion no one expects. They assume addiction is a death wish, but for many of us, it was the opposite. It was a way to remain inside a world that felt too sharp, too loud, too relentless to endure without help. It was not a rejection of life. It was a negotiation with it. Before addiction, there was friction, constant, unnamed friction. The kind you do not realize is abnormal because you have never known anything else. Your body is always braced. Your thoughts never quite land. Rest feels unsafe. Silence feels loud. You grow up thinking this is just what being alive feels like, and quietly wondering how everyone else seems to manage it so easily. Then, one day, something intervenes. The intervention does not announce itself as danger. It arrives as relief, a loosening, a softening, a sense of internal alignment that feels so corrective it borders on revelation. For the first time, your nervous system stands down. Your mind stops pacing. The world becomes inhabitable. You think, not dramatically, not foolishly, but with sober clarity. Oh, this is possible. That moment is not weakness. That moment is discovery. It is also the moment the story changes. Once you have felt that kind of relief, the memory of it becomes a reference point, a comparison you carry with you. Reality, unmediated, now has a rival. Slowly, quietly, you begin measuring life against the one thing that made it tolerable. This is where people get addiction wrong. They think it is about excess, about appetite, about lack of control. Addiction is not about wanting more. It is about wanting less. Less noise, less intensity, less pain, less self. The substance is not the object of desire. It is the tool, the interface, the way out. Addiction is a relationship in which the addict trades sovereignty for silence. At first, it feels mutual. The substance is dependable. It does not argue with your experience. It does not minimize your pain. It does not ask you to justify why you feel the way you do. It simply shows up and does what it promised. For someone whose inner world has always felt like a storm they were expected to survive without shelter, that consistency feels like care. The care has a cost. It always does. The cost is subtle at first, a rearrangement of priorities, a quiet dependency disguised as routine. You do not need it until you do. You do not plan around it until you notice that everything else has started orbiting it. You are still functioning, still showing up, still convincing yourself you are in control. Then, one day, you realize you are not living anymore. You are managing. This is where shame enters, not as a consequence, but as architecture. Shame builds the walls addiction lives inside. It tells you that your need disqualifies you from belonging, that your reliance makes you lesser, that if anyone truly saw the machinery behind your composure, they would step back. Shame does not force silence, it suggests it, and suggestion is far more powerful. You hide, not just from others, but from yourself. You minimize, you rationalize. You tell stories that keep the system intact. And because addiction often still works for a long time, you mistake survival for health. People talk about rock bottom as if it is a dramatic collapse. Many addictions never end in spectacle. They end in narrowing, in the slow contraction of possibility, in the quiet grief of realizing that you are no longer becoming, just maintaining. Addiction does not only take substances into the body, it takes time, presence, and alternate futures. Years do not vanish all at once, they dissolve. Mornings blur into recovery, evenings shrink into anticipation, dreams become inconvenient, curiosity dulls. Somewhere along the way, you realize that you have been alive but absent. That realization is its own kind of breaking. Recovery does not arrive like salvation, it arrives like exposure. The buffer is gone, the anesthetic is removed. Suddenly, you're face to face with the very intensity you once learned to escape. The thoughts return, the sensations, the emotions you were never taught how to metabolize because no one noticed how much you were carrying. This is where false narratives do real damage. Recovery is not purity. It is not moral superiority. It is not becoming immune to pain. Recovery is the decision to stay present without numbing. It is the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding internal authority. It is learning that discomfort is not an emergency, even when your body insists that it is. It is discovering that you can survive yourself. Relapse, when it happens, is not failure, it is signal. It points to the places still holding unspoken pain, the places where compassion has not yet reached, the places that learned long ago that escape was safer than presence. Here is the truth that deserves to be said without apology. Most addicts were not careless people. They were sensitive ones. They felt deeply in a world that does not teach people how to feel. Addiction was not a flaw in character. It was an adaptation, a strategy that worked when nothing else did. The tragedy is not that it existed. The tragedy is that it eventually demanded everything in return. Here is where this stops being about addicts and starts being about everyone. Addiction is not confined to substances. Anyone who has ever clung to a person, an identity, productivity, control, belief, distraction, anger, righteousness, anything to avoid facing their inner life knows this pattern. We all reach for something to make reality manageable. We all negotiate with discomfort. The addict simply goes further, faster, and pays more visibly. What remains after addiction is not innocence, it is clarity, a scarred awareness that knows how seductive relief can be, a nervous system that has learned the hard way what happens when silence is outsourced. There is a strange wisdom that comes from having stood at that edge, an understanding of how fragile humans are and how desperate we are to feel okay. I do not write this as someone who conquered addiction. I write it as someone who understands its intelligence, its logic, its appeal. I write it as someone who knows how convincing the lie is and how brave it is to choose presence anyway. The addict is not broken. The addict is someone who learned too early that reality could be unbearable and found a way to survive it. Survival, even when it costs us dearly, is not a failure. It is the raw material from which real transformation is forged. If we are willing to face it without anesthetic, without myth, and without flinching. Jason Gray. I've been sober for 11 months now, but the reason I originally started drinking and smoking weed was absolutely as an attempt to make life more tolerable. I was always braced for life's difficulties, always ready for things to go wrong. And alcohol and marijuana were things that I found that I thought helped me to cope, to escape, to feel better. And they worked in that way for a while. And then something else slowly happened. They started to make me more nervous, ungrounded, reactive, less healthy, and always tired. Once I started to rely on drinking and smoking for relief, I found that I always needed more relief. The habit trained my mind to think that unmediated life was too much to handle. And that thinking bled into every part of my life and expectations. That's a hard way to live. It sets up an impossible way of existing. If life unmediated is too much, where does that leave reality? Somewhere else. I became detached from what was right in front of me. I felt ashamed of my habits, but dared not tell a soul, for that would expose me too much and put my coping mechanisms at risk. For me, it was hard to stop drinking, but I had been silently suffering for long enough to want it badly. I faltered and I struggled with having my anxiety and reactions to life's difficulties laid bare in front of me. Finally, able to see how I was acting without being in a numb fog. And little by little bit, I changed. Day by day, I took back control of my behavior. I regained control over my impulses. Since achieving sobriety, I realized that I contain the tools within myself to cope with life's difficulties. But it's not always easy, and I've been experiencing difficulties lately. I badly broke my leg a couple of months ago and needed serious surgery. During my recovery, I was surprised at how easy it was to stay sober. And I was very thankful for that because if I were drinking, I absolutely know I wouldn't have healed as fast. And numbing myself in an attempt to cope would have made the whole experience much more difficult, for sure. So restraint during that period was a big accomplishment for me. I was in bed for 6 weeks. However, now that I'm back on my feet and living mostly a normal life again, things have not stayed easy. Medical bills have been steadily rolling in, and I'm uninsured. At first, I handled it quite well. I applied for financial assistance and was hopeful about the situation, but the bills kept coming in and grew to $150,000. Okay, I thought, that's a lot, but I stayed calm and kept my head up. Then the bill from the anesthesiologist came in. My heart sank. An additional $57,000 are owed. For a couple of hours of work, $57,000. What the heck? And just like that, I wanted a drink. I hadn't had that thought in many months, but suddenly that's where my brain automatically went when I was faced with an overwhelming challenge. And if it weren't for being a part of Alcoholics Anonymous, going to meetings, having a sponsor, and for Jason's writing on this topic, I think I would have submitted to the urge to drink. After all, life's difficulties are why I started drinking to begin with. But I didn't drink. I paused. I breathed. I thought deeply about it and decided that having a drink would only make me feel worse. I'm so grateful to have that ability today. 1 year ago, I could not imagine life without alcohol and pot. I thought I loved those things, but I was struggling to find peace and accept life as it was. Today, I am strong and resolute in my happiness, my abilities, and content with my life, despite the financial jeopardy I face. And what an incredible gift that is.